Okay. Be mindful of time. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our Climate Capital virtual convening. Like always, we come to you with big questions, and more importantly, big thinkers, people who are active and global leaders in the space. And we're delighted today to be featuring Ailun Yang from Bloomberg Philanthropies. I'll quickly get us started with a brief intro, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Andrew, who will be introducing our esteemed panelists today. Really quickly about what we're trying to accomplish today. Today is not one day of a nice conversation, and that's it. Telesto has made an enduring commitment to the question of connecting climate capital. We have a lot of momentum that we're building on, notably our official side event at the US Africa Leaders Summit, where actually we first got connected to Ailun. And then we're building with a network of global leaders who are committed to putting this puzzle together. We've learned that climate finance and the activation of it requires multi-sectoral stakeholder cooperation. And to do that, it's not one person thinking about one thing, it's many people coming together under the banner of something much bigger. And so today is an instance of that enduring commitment. We bring together other leaders on a regular cadence, and we hope you'll join us for other convenings, both virtually and later this year on the continent of Africa. So with that, a brief overview about Telesto. We work as partners to those in the climate capital space, and some of that has to do on the ESG readiness side and getting started with that to be a better recipient of the climate capital inflows. We work with leadership teams, understanding that these questions are really decided at the most executive level of an organization. With these new financing mechanisms, and we do look to Ailun to help us understand some of these new mechanisms in which philanthropy is involved, making sure that, again, organizations, both from public and private sector, can take advantage and utilize. Part of the enduring commitment to climate finance goes hand in hand with a commitment to decarbonization. We help our partners do so. And again, we look to think about broader sustainability strategies and how it integrates with value generation and top line growth. And at the end of the day, we know a lot of this requires reporting and really excellent data. So that's another element of the work we do with our partners. And finally, just as a quick overview of what's to come next. Today, again, we're very, very excited to have Ailun with us. And our next one will be 3 weeks, and we'll be featuring Dieppe, who is joining us from the IFC. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Andrew, who will be introducing our esteemed panelist. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. As we said, extremely excited to have Ailun joining us today on the webinar. For those of you who don't necessarily know Ailun is, she manages the international initiatives of the environment program at Bloomberg Philanthropies. And she focuses on the energy transition, air pollution, and sustainable finance. And she comes to this role with over 15 years of experience in the field of climate and philanthropy. And Ailun has developed a really unique combination of skill sets in mobilizing environmental activism, deploying data-driven strategies, and leveraging high-profile partnerships. And we're very excited to bring her on here to get to know her background a little bit better and her viewpoint on some of these critical topics in the climate finance space. So Ailun, welcome to the webinar. We're really glad to have you here. I wanted to start off just by first getting a sense of sort of the work that Bloomberg is doing in this space. So, as an environmental program manager with Bloomberg Philanthropies, you all focus on a wide array of domains, notably on fighting climate change, both in the US and also around the world. Can you tell us just a little bit about sort of what is the portfolio of major initiatives that Bloomberg is focusing on in the environmental space, and in particular climate finance at the present time?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so pleased to be here. And thank you for your nice introduction, Andrew and Alex, for the invitation. So let me just introduce a little bit of Bloomberg Philanthropies. Our mission is to ensure better and longer lives for the greatest number of people. So everything we do contribute to the broader vision. At the environment team, we work on a few things. Global energy transition is one of them. We also work on cities and also air pollution and also oceans. Finance is, of course, a major angle to everything we do. We need finance to make all of the climate solutions in this area work. So that's the reason why that we also try to play into the Bloomberg strength of the unique connection and the credibility with a lot of the financial sector players to try to bring a lot of the different players into the same conversation. Let me just say what is our unique angle. Well, first of all, our funding is philanthropic. So by nature, it serves more of a catalyst role. However, we do believe that when we are talking about climate solutions, we need to make sure that we are working towards mechanisms and or solutions that can actually bring in private sector player, because we believe that private sector funding is essentially what will deliver a lot of the solutions. But of course, the philanthropy has a small role to contribute, and the government also have a very major role to use their kind of funding effectively and putting the policy space. So that's our vision of how all of these different components of climate finance come together.
That's great. Maybe you can just go into a little bit more detail on sort of how the focus of what Bloomberg is working on in the climate and environmental spaces differs between sort of the US focused portfolio and the international portfolio.
Right. So as I explained that the philanthropy funding is more about catalyze changes. And therefore, we try to think about what's the gap and how we can be most helpful. In the case of US or Europe, normally the role of civil society is more about identifying some challenges, try to raise the awareness of those challenges, and also try to play some kind of convening or facilitator's role. Sometimes we also have a role to play in building some capacity, but considering the capacity of the governments and market are fairly strong in these places, and therefore philanthropy doesn't really need to be so involved in delivering the solution. And hopefully when people are all aware of the challenges and problems, then there's a much better capacity to actually deliver a lot of the answers here. I guess in developing country, what we have noticed is that there's in general much less capacity in the market, in policymakers' understanding about what type of enabling environment they need to put in first to trigger changes. Also in the ability of different types of stakeholders in how to row in the same direction. And therefore, the focus of philanthropy will be more on building capacity and help deliver solutions. And I think that's to that end, we are very grateful that philanthropy dollar is willing to play some of these roles, because I think some of the environment, suffer from the fact that there's a lot of perceived risks and that preventing capital from flowing, and therefore philanthropy often can try to cover the kind of things that government might not want to do, or be the pilot in taking on some type of risks that the market players might not yet be ready. But the idea strategy is really try to create certain good cases and pilots and really have a strategy to scale that up. That's what we consider as the role of philanthropists, and how we consider our role a bit differently in different markets.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I'm glad you sort of bridged into talking a little bit about what's special about the philanthropic approach. You rightly pointed out that you have a very different sort of value proposition to commercial investors. I would also say in many ways, especially in the international environment space, you also have sort of a unique value proposition relative to development finance institutions like the World Bank and IFC and all of that. Can you maybe just taking one step back, sort of help us better understand what is the philanthropic approach or philosophy in the climate finance space? And in particular, since you all do a lot of work in the renewable energy transition or clean energy transition, what is sort of the philanthropic philosophy or Bloomberg's philosophy to approaching this topic?
Yeah, I think that the bigger challenge we are facing together now is, of course, climate change. Is the biggest crisis we are facing. There's really not a lot of need to educate anybody about the importance of developing the clean side of solutions. And you would, imagine that given the fact that, people understand how the population growth and how a lot of the future, economic growth is in emerging markets or developing country, money will naturally flow this way. And that's also in line with where the areas that climate change impacts will be felt the strongest, and the disasters will be probably the most harmful. However, that's not happening. And by the way, this is also not the problem of we don't have enough money on the table. There's enough capital in the world for a lot of these solutions. And so the reason why that we don't, that's not yet happening. And of course, there's a few different diagnoses to the problem. I do believe the major one, of course, is the in-country, on-the-ground environment, policy environment, enabling environment to give the capital enough potential investment, enough confidence that this will be a good long-term business. There's certain risks that's not just unique to energy projects, but more to some of the markets themselves, and of course that goes back to some of the even more deeply rooted problem in our global finance and economic system. But then if we look a bit closer, there's also some specific challenges with, nowadays we often hear that, we are ready to look at certain markets, but where are the projects? And so therefore, there's also the challenge or the gap in terms of the capacity to put together bankable projects. And whose job it is to help prepare those projects in a more mature market. Of course, the market players will do that, or sometimes government will help a little bit. But in most part of developing country, that's also a gap in capacity. And then the other challenge is how we actually ensure there's an effective financial intermediation that will actually channel the money into the market. The ideal situation is when you have, the policy ready, then you would have players, especially those multilateral development banks, play a helpful role in using the concession funding in a strategic way to help unlock broader private sector funding. However, I think that what we are seeing is a real lack of effective mechanism that can actually make that happen. Either a lot of the MDBs or other type of development, financial institutions don't feel comfortable in certain, markets, or when they actually feel comfortable, they are not necessarily crowd in capital. In some cases, they even crowd out capital because of how they want to actually invest in these projects instead of using the funding to actually leverage even bigger private sector funding. And so these are really, all the challenges that we are struggling, and coming back to what role the philanthropy can play, in response to some of the major challenges that I just described. I will sum that up as trying to help really build the enabling environment, the policies needed, and then try to see how we can also beef up the project preparation capacity in certain markets, but also try to dive into some of the potential blended finance vehicles, innovative mechanisms that can channel money in more effectively.
I'm glad you brought up blended finance, and also because I think it's one of these sort of unique tools that people assume philanthropies or philanthropic-like lenders are most well positioned to leverage. Can you first talk to us about what is blended, or sometimes also called first loss capital, and then why is it so important in the climate finance space in particular?
First, I want to describe the scale of the different type of finance, so people understand, have the realistic expectation of what role each player can play in order to really deliver the climate solution and the market size needed to help us achieve 1.5 degree of climate protection. We are talking about trillions of dollars, but let's come back to the smallest player here, which is the philanthropy sector. And I would be very proud to say that we are a sector that has been growing really fast, and thanks to a lot of the commitments of philanthropists around the world, and more philanthropists are joining this effort. However, we are essentially only talking about a market of global climate philanthropists that wouldn't be more than a few $1 billion a year. Right. So and let's look at the current intermediaries that we are hoping to play the role, which is a lot of the multilateral development banks, and of course they have a balance sheet that's maybe about a few $100 billion. So this is kind of like the chain of reaction that we need to create here, and I think that it will be very difficult to expect philanthropy dollar that can really fill the role of first loss or blended capitals that will actually get us all the way. Really, it's more also, to be honest, if a lot of the development finance is playing that role effectively, then hopefully the philanthropy dollar can also be more focused on things like policy recommendation, research, capacity building, technical assistance, instead of actually coming into project finance themselves. That is, I will say, not an ideal place for philanthropy to actually play. However, given the urgency and how we now want to actually think about how philanthropy can help create some innovative experiments, and that therefore there's also quite a number of philanthropy foundations that are ready to roll up sleeves and actually look into that. And what does that will actually look like? The most important capital that need to be blended is concessional funding and the real private sector funding, because concessional funding that is that will offer the much better terms and lower the costs or other type of risks for the real private sector to come in, and of course the philanthropy dollars can come in and be structured in a similar way as the concessional funding, especially these are essentially funding that does not require a return, even though the size is extremely small. And therefore, the challenge that we are dealing with is that how could you actually use something that might be nimble and flexible in nature, but much smaller in size, but then try to play similar roles as the much bigger concessional portal funding in order to actually bring in and crowd in the real private sector funding.
Thanks very much for that answer. Just as a quick follow-up, I love the way that you laid it out, that we need trillions. Philanthropic funding is something on the order of a couple billion, and maybe the multilateral development banks is a couple hundreds of billions. What's sort of the average leverage ratio here? I mean, is that billions going to be enough to entice enough private sector investment to fill that gap of trillions? Or is the challenge going to be that we need more leverage, or we need to reduce that leverage, or sorry, I should say rather expand that leverage ratio so that the philanthropic monies that we have, the concessional funding from MDBs that we have is enough to fill that gap? I mean, just in your opinion, how can we help close that gap through this sort of delicate balance of concessional first loss capital and private investment to fill the remainder?
We have a few projects ongoing where we are also experimenting exactly this question of what type of ratio and potential that we are looking at. I will say this: I think that it's a very it's a very interesting dilemma when you are told that $1 of philanthropy funding can trigger $20 of other things, and that's, let me say, that's a very high ratio according to the industry standard. On the one hand, you celebrate things like that. You say, "Oh, that's sounds like a great partnership." At the same time, that really put a question of, well, then what is really the additionality of the funding? When things get to 1 to 20, you sometimes do wonder, maybe some of these projects are happening anyway, and with or without a philanthropy dollar. I think in general, because it's very new, we don't yet have an industry shared a view about how to define additionality of this, and therefore I will say, in my opinion, it really also depends on, what type of risk we're talking about. Some of it, even if you hear the ratio is 1 to 5, it sounds low, but it might actually be creating some real new, experiments that can inform much bigger development. In general, I feel like it's a very specific window that this type of strategy should be deployed and could be effective. It needs to be markets where there is a fair, decent policy environment. Doesn't need to be perfect, but really it can't be like if there's not even some basic policy framework that will make it quite impossible to jump into this. It would also need to be a market where there's also fairly decent project preparation capacity, where you would see a healthy supply of potentially bankable projects, and then you try to and then you also want to look at this market. On the other hand, you don't want this market to already have a lot of experience already in crowding in private sector. Then we don't really need to do that. It's almost like when they have let's just say first a few projects but the markets, let's say the solar market of a given country, they've had maybe a handful of projects, but haven't really gone to over the first gigawatt of installed capacity. That's kind of where the sweet spot that we believe the philanthropy dollar will make the biggest impact. However, I think that it's very much case by case and need to look at a specific situation of the countries.
That's very helpful. That actually addresses a question that just came up in the Q&A, which was, what are sort of the specific characteristics or scenarios where concessional funding is most successful? So it's great to hear that you were sort of already thinking ahead and figured that one out. I'd like to address one more question from the audience before we move on to the next topic. But so, obviously there are multiple stakeholders involved in trying to orchestrate this delicate balance of concessional funding, private funding, and MDB funding. What are some of the big challenges of getting all these stakeholders or partners to row in the same direction together, meaning work together for the common pursuit of trying to get a project invested and then have it generate a return which can pay back the investment?
I think the best way to organize a lot of this is it should be a country led country-based platform. So some of the existing initiatives like the JP, the Just the Energy Transition Platform that was announced in Indonesia and Vietnam and South Africa, those provides very interesting, experiments, because I think that like you said, it's very important to bring the different stakeholders together, and how to actually have a platform that is blessed by very senior political leaders. And if we look at the example of the Indonesian platform, we have the leaders from the US, Indonesia, and Japan, announced that together. And then you have GFANS, who helps bring in which is the network of over 500 financial institutions committed to net zero, and they bring their members to the table to help contribute to the current $10 billion initial commitment of the funding, and then you have all these other players. I think that in my opinion, JP provides a very good example of how that convening kind of model could look like. When you have a JP, you have a secretariat, and then you have a go-to place. So to make some of these efforts also a little more institutionalized. But I want to say that that's not sufficient. Of course, there's a lot of other parallel initiatives. There's the whole conversation, around the Bridgetown and the MDB reform conversation that need to happen as well. And then, of course, different countries need to be working on their own net zero commitments or energy transition plans. And so, all of the different pieces need to come together. But I will say at the core of it, JP or the other country platform that is, in the forming, provide a good example of how the coordination mechanism could look like.
Yeah, that's great. MDBs keep coming up in a lot of these discussion points. I wonder if you could just call out for us. I think a lot of people look to them as really critical leaders at the international level and driving a lot of the energy transition, given how large their balance sheets are and how they're not necessarily at the same level of expectations of return on average as commercial investors. Can you just explicitly call out for us what you think the role of MDBs is and should be in sort of this attempts to stave off the worst of climate change through climate investment and climate finance?
MDBs play a very important role because they are trusted partners of a lot of developing countries. They bring such knowledge, expertise, not just on the subject matter, the market technologies, but also understanding of local situations, and they also bring a lot of concessional funding, which is so needed to get a lot of this rolling. So I think that they are it is imperative for all of us that MDBs succeed in their role. I do think that some of the there's all kinds of diagnose of what's missing and what is not what they are not currently doing sufficiently, and I can share a few examples. Of course, like I said, if we need trillions of dollars to actually make things happen, then the problem is then the current funding in MDBs for this collectively are not enough. So that this capital level is it will be the first challenge. And then the second thing is that if you look deeper into, but then for the money that is actually available and actually there at the MDBs, we see that a lot of that are not really spent or used, mobilized effectively, and that's of course a problem, because the MDBs will have to go about a lot, bolder and bigger, faster in terms of disseminating their capitals. And the next observation, which is related to why they are not moving as quickly, is of course they require AAA, and they don't really want to take on a lot of the risks that maybe they should be encouraged to take on. And then if the MDBs can't really take on more risks, then I think that make it a little difficult. But let me just say that even if we are not necessarily demanding the change of the requirement, the credits level requirement, there are still a lot of things that MDBs can do. A lot of the existing mechanisms or product that they can enhance to actually help with a kind of creating the incentive for private sector to come in more. For example, a lot of the guarantee mechanisms. I think that there's a definitely the core. A lot of the hope is that to really look at some of the existing mechanisms that they already have, and think about how that can be really revamped or repurposed or scaled up to serve a little bit of the role. I will say the last one, and that's fairly that has been often discussed as the challenge is how much the MDBs actually have an explicit mandate or requirement that their work is to bring in private sector money. I'm not sure that is the case right now, but if that is not the case, that is not part of the KPI, then of course that is not something that executives at MDBs think about a lot. If there will be such clear requirement that really $1 of your funding need to show like how you bring in this much private sector funding, then that's a different situation. So I think that there's also the change of mentality or perception of roles here.
Yeah, I think you've definitely hit on something very important. And talking about the KPIs, I think the private sector component is a really critical point altogether. But also, I think in some senses, maybe even deployment, meaning capital deployment from them, is maybe not a strong enough KPI, because you talked a lot about, I think, financial risk aversion. I think there's also non-financial risk aversion in a lot of these MDBs lending requirements. I think something we heard about a lot is some of these non-financial disclosures, for example, do no harm plans, ESG reporting. If you're a really small entrepreneur in a developing country, this stuff is very foreign to you and not something you would expect if you're applying for a loan from an MDB. But I just wanted to say, that resonates a lot with me, and I think others. So thanks for bringing that point up a lot. So transitioning maybe a little bit to just talking about climate entrepreneurs, and if especially on the smaller side, some of these bigger debt instruments or equity instruments are not necessarily extremely viable or harder to come by for them. There's always sort of grant funding, which is available for them as well. And it's a nice substitute for sort of traditional finance. And I know that a lot of entrepreneurs in the developing world in the climate finance space are very excited about getting access to philanthropic grants. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the current state of grant financing is for climate entrepreneurs in emerging markets from philanthropy? And then also about some of the challenges you're seeing in leveling up that degree of, or sorry, the volume of grant financing?
We are doing some experimental, I would say, just explore this area about how philanthropy might support business entrepreneurs. I think that there's interesting organizations like a Climate Nexus or different kind of labs, climate finance labs that are very quite focused in this area. I think ultimately the questions that the philanthropists need to think about is again, what will make the biggest impact. And I think that it is just at least our assessment that many of the developing countries, some of the government and the policies need to give some first signal about some of this for businesses to actually get serious about the potential opportunities. And therefore that's also the reason why that at this stage a lot of the focus of our philanthropy funding is more about engaging the governments to think about the type of policy measures or roadmaps needed. But I think that everywhere we very inspired by the enthusiasm of business entrepreneurs, and without them it's very difficult to see like how things would happen quickly, and especially in Africa, for example, we noticed that a lot of the entrepreneur is also very concentrated among the youth. The youth play a very big role, and it's very exciting to see that they think that this is the future, and they want to get involved in the climate business from early on. I will say that we are at quite early stage in experimenting what works, what's the best way to organize the support for such initiatives, how we strike the right balance between supporting this type of initiative versus supporting policy changes. That's again, we think is the first condition to make a lot of these happen. So yeah, I think that look forward to staying in touch on this topic, but again, just really want to give a shout out to the importance of entrepreneurship for this topic.
Yeah. Since you touched on it again some more about the enabling environment, can you talk to us just a little bit about, enabling environment is this big sort of, I think, opaque thing that people talk a lot about, but it'd be great to get more specific on what in particular are the gaps that are there in terms of supporting investment and entrepreneurs. Typically, I mean, insofar as it's possible to sort of draw some general conclusions across emerging markets, where are the biggest enabling environment gaps? And where have you seen people succeed in sort of closing those gaps?
The most important signal that the government need to give, of course, is whether the country has an ambitious NDBs and publish energy transition plan document, or I think that it is quite important to know a leader of a country has climate and clean energy solutions high up on the agenda. For people to have confidence in this place, and not just the leader, but also the right kind of cabinet or ministerial level capacity out there. So I think that's that is an important criteria when people are thinking about where we should go first. In terms of what type of policy that can really help bridge this, other than the bigger kind of a direction, normally the most important policy is more around dealing with help with business understand that there's manageable offtake risks. So there's the right kind of power purchase agreement or laws that says that how any renewable energy produced in this market or country will be in the case of some country that is a state monopoly, that the state monopoly will buy it from you, or what is these other type of individual agreement, because that without that understanding, the legal understanding, it is again it's a little difficult. I would say in terms of entrepreneurs, then really it's a list of everything. It's how easy it is to register a business like this, how likely they might get the land required for this. I think that when you have like the bigger government vision, then it's very important to see that there's the right level on all parts of the government, the right people at all levels of the government to actually develop the more detailed implementation plan, or at least that can work with the interested business to figure things out. And I think that the interesting thing for philanthropy, for example, is when we support initiative like, we don't want to see coal-fired plants in the US. In the case of US, we the Beyond Carbon coal work that we have done have successfully helped the shut down or retired almost 60-70% of the coal here. And for that piece of type of work, what you need to find is one or two leverage points and angles that can stop something. And however, when you come to actually helping renewable energy grow, helping something nice, good to happen quickly, then it requires everything need to happen in order to and that's a very different kind of model. And again, it's also the question of where philanthropy think is the most strategic thing, where we get engaged and where we think might not be our priority.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's obviously the solution needs to be very multifaceted when you're trying to create something from nothing, essentially. On that topic, wanted to field a question from the audience, which is around sort of intermediaries that support the capability building, I think, of climate entrepreneurs. In particular, what do you see the role of, say, for example, accelerators and incubators being in this space? And are philanthropic entities such as Bloomberg Philanthropies thinking or already have accelerators, incubators in place to help specifically with climate entrepreneurs, given some of the special nuance that climate enterprise tends to have over just sort of, an average consumer packaged goods entrepreneur?
We are involved in a number of initiatives and trying to learn the lesson. Also on that front, for example, we have been a long-term partner of CPI climate policy initiative and their climate finance lab. I think that the lab the focus of this initiative is more about educating or trying to bring in financial institutions. So basically, try to tell them, hey, this is what investing in a wind farm look like, and this is the type of opportunities and challenges you would encounter, and that's kind of one type of innovation. For example, in the case of Indonesia and India, we are supporting the solar accelerator, and that on that front, it is more about supporting our partners to help map out with potential investors and the local government where those projects are, and provide some of the initial technical and financial and legal assessment of it. I don't think that philanthropy dollar should go all the way to get everything prepared, but I think that at least try to help identify where are some of the potential hotspot for clean energy growth. We are also quite involved in working closely with GFANS, of course, and on the JP country platform. I mean, I think that's a much bigger scale, but you can also think that in some ways that's also a lab and an experiment to see how some of this might work. I will say it depends very much on the country and the technology to understand what type of initiative will be most helpful. In our experience, single country, single technology, very focused, initiative, and try to facilitate and invite potential project developers and financials together. That's one model that really works. The kind of lab idea, it would be like helpful when the market players are not yet familiar with something. But once they get to a certain level, then I think we need to work ourselves out of our job very quickly, because that's maybe we move to the next country. So it depends very much on where any particular country and market is at on the nexus of the country enabling environment and the technology, specific technology, what's the status of that in a given country, and I think that we need to always make choices based on these factors to know where philanthropy dollar can make the biggest impact and how we get ourselves out quickly.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I want to address another question from the audience, which is about sort of how Bloomberg measures impact. So when you work with different partners, or when you invest directly or provide sort of concessional capital, what are your expectations in terms of reporting on impact from the project in particular? And what about specifically those relating to emissions or other GHG related KPIs, and potentially, are you even thinking about scope 4 or abated emissions? I know that's a long question, but let's try to see if we can address it in pieces.
We, for us, the ultimate goal, of course, is we achieve net zero, stay on 1.5, and we measure that in terms of the number of coal plants retired, the amount of clean energy get connected, the amount of electric vehicle, and so these are I think that there's a lot of very good reference studies on how much the clean energy and the energy system or the transport system should look like to help us achieve the final goal. No matter it's from BNEF or from IEA, from IPCC, and those are all our important the reference we use to understand whether we are on track with the effort that we are doing. And so these are some of the bigger goals. However, I think that we do have to break it down into something that's more measurable on the ground, and on that front, I will say considering that the majority of our funding, philanthropy, and not just us, I mean, we as a sector, the majority of philanthropy funding go into research, policy, capacity building, and there's some fairly concrete measurables there. Are we seeing this policy being introduced? Is the renewable energy target being increased? Are we seeing a certain power purchase measure being put in place? Or are we seeing the capacity of the specific part of government or market being increased? And so these will be quite concrete things that we might be tracking. Like I explained, that the use philanthropy dollar into put philanthropy dollar into real project finance is a fairly new and I would say that growing area that we are actually, to be quite frank, in the middle of understanding how we measure our impacts there. And I think on that front, really some of the potential criteria we can use is that do we actually see something new here? Yeah, like when we say that it's innovative, what's innovative about this? How that actually help overcome some of the risks and barriers to make something happen. And of course, the scale. What's the ratio? What's the scale? And like we discussed, I also think that we need to be a little careful about ratio because if once we factor in additionality, then the ratio question also become a little bit tricky.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. But how about climate related impact? I mean, is Bloomberg yet at the stage about thinking about potentially abated emissions of the projects that invests in, or looking at just in general sort of the GHG reduction?
What could you just explain what is the
so for example, if you were to invest in a solar farm, or sorry, to be, you were to provide blended capital for a solar farm, for example, obviously it sounds like the private capital catalyzed is a really critical KPI that you think about. That's the whole leverage ratio. But sort of at the project level, would Bloomberg be considering, okay, what is the reduction in the use of, I'm making things up here, diesel generators as a result of the implementation of this solar farm, something like that? So that would be considered abated emissions in this circumstance. I'm just curious if you all are yet at this stage of saying, we're looking at a project level about what is our impact on the environment. It sounds like taking coal-fired power plants offline for sure in the United States, big abated emissions component. But just returning to sort of the generating something from nothing side of the equation, is that something you're thinking about yet?
Absolutely. I think that this goes back to the understanding that a lot of the climate actions deliver co-benefits. As you mentioned, that diesel, it's not just for climate, and it's also a major emitter for a cause of air pollution, which is another topic that we work on that kills a lot of people around the world every year. We a lot of our work look at avoided air pollutants as a co-benefit that we try to measure, and on that to that end, the lives saved if we don't have to do that. If we are looking at clean cooking, for example, that's another area where indoor air pollution causes a lot of deaths every year. So I think that the co-benefits, the other benefits that's not purely climate is definitely what we care about as well. Like I introduced that the mission of the foundation is to help ensure better, longer life for the greatest number of people, and so for that objective, we take into public health and the other related conditions for the better life qualities also very seriously.
And how challenging is it to track some of those co-benefits? Those sound like some very lofty and obviously excellent KPIs, but how challenging is it to figure out what is the material impact on, for example, lives saved from the projects that you invest in?
It is very challenging for two reasons. First reason is that the data collection, system, especially in developing countries, in general, generally, to be developed. It's not yet very advanced, and so it's not always easy to get the right kind of data. And I would also say that the understanding of the impact of a lot of these measures mostly are also done in developed countries, and therefore you don't have a lot of original similar research that is more tailored towards the specific lifestyle or weather condition or everything in developing countries. So it is challenging. However, I will say that Bloomberg is one of those foundations that data matters a lot to us. My Bloomberg always say that you can't manage what you can't measure. So we put aside a fairly significant amount of our funding to build up those data infrastructure to help track our progress, and also to help inform the effectiveness of policy measures as well. And we do consider data foundation as a very important piece for everything that we are doing.
That's great. Well, we're running up on time here, and I want to conclude on a bit of a high note here. So I'm going to ask you one last question. So what keeps you excited about where your work and where climate finance is going?
I am actually very excited. I think that the last few years, we've seen an explosive growth of voluntary commitments from financial institutions, corporations. Sure, there's a lot of details to be worked out, but I do feel that climate solution is becoming so mainstream, and that's the one thing that gave me hope. I would say the second thing that gave me a lot of hope and enthusiasm is every time when I travel for work to a lot of countries, especially in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, you see not only the people's enthusiastic to work on these topics, but also so many new and fun and innovative ideas, especially from the youth and from young people. And I really feel like the future is in good hands.
Great note to end on. Thank you so much, Ailun. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the webinar, and hope to keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ailun.
Bye all.